Ethan Rivers had never been particularly good at anything. He wasn't a bad historian, but let's face it, his lectures weren't the most engaging, his papers didn't make headlines, and his research was often ignored by anyone who mattered. He was a man who existed in the margins of academia, a nondescript figure in a nondescript life. Yet there was one thing Ethan had mastered, one thing that set him apart from the crowd in a way that was almost absurd: gravity. He didn't mean the science of it, mind you. No, Ethan had an almost childlike ability to manipulate gravitational forces. It wasn't like what you read about in science fiction. There were no floating objects or cosmic disruptions. He simply had the power to make objects behave in ways they weren't supposed to, usually without even realizing it. Like that time in a coffee shop when his cup hovered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, before spilling across the table and launching a chain of events that would later prove to be far more significant than he could ever have imagined. It was a cool autumn afternoon when it happened. Ethan was sitting in his usual spot by the window of the small cafe, the one with the cracked tiles and faded, half-peeled wallpaper that smelled faintly of cinnamon. He had just opened his latest history book, ready to delve into another boring chapter on ancient civilizations. His laptop was open beside him, waiting for the usual procrastination. It was the perfect environment to accomplish nothing. Ethan didn't think much of it when he felt the usual warm, pleasant tingle in his fingertips. He didn't even realize what he was doing. It started innocently enough, just a gentle push of the hand toward his coffee cup, as if to shift it slightly into a more comfortable position. The cup, as cups tend to do, began its descent toward the edge of the table, but then something odd happened. It hovered. Ethan blinked, confused, watching his coffee cup freeze in mid-air as if held up by an invisible hand. His initial thought was, "I must be more tired than I thought." But the cup didn't fall. It stayed suspended there, inches above the table, spinning lazily as though gravity had suddenly taken a lunch break. In that brief moment, everything in the cafe seemed to stop. The conversations of the patrons dulled, the clink of spoons against porcelain became muffled, and even the rustling of his book seemed distant, like the sound of an old radio being turned down. Then, just as quickly, the cup fell, but not in the usual way. It spun erratically, flinging coffee across the table with precision, a few drops narrowly missing the woman seated next to him. The barista, a lanky young man with a set of wild tattoos spiraling up his arm, was suddenly at his side, staring at the mess in disbelief. Did you just do that?" the barista asked, his eyes wide with alarm. Ethan, still in a daze, rubbed his forehead. "What? No, I didn't mean to. It was just a mistake." The woman at the table across from him squinted, obviously puzzled by the strange turn of events. Ethan barely noticed her, too busy wiping coffee off his lap and scrambling to reassemble himself. He'd had strange experiences before, accidents, odd coincidences, but this felt different. He couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. Something he couldn't control. Before he could sort through the rising panic in his chest, a voice interrupted him from behind. "Excuse me," a woman said, her voice low and firm, "is your name Ethan Rivers?" He turned, blinking against the light coming in through the window. Standing there, dressed in sleek, futuristic clothes that seemed out of place in the rundown cafe, was a woman who didn't look like anyone he knew. There was something about her, sharp eyes, an unsettling confidence, that immediately made him feel like a fish in a tank. She wasn't asking about the coffee spill. She wasn't asking for an apology. I'm sorry," he stammered. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer. "I'm Serafina. And I've been looking for you." Ethan hadn't seen her again after that encounter. Not immediately, at least. His mind had dismissed the odd meeting, though, deep down, he knew it was something that couldn't be brushed aside. The coffee shop incident had left a nagging feeling in his stomach. How had his hand influenced the cup like that? Was it even possible? More importantly, was it his fault? Days passed, and life resumed its usual rhythm. Ethan lectured on ancient Greece, received the usual amount of disinterested feedback, and continued to waste far too much time on obscure historical anomalies. But nothing was the same. A strange itch gnawed at him. He had a sense that something, or someone, was watching him, waiting for something. He couldn't explain it. Maybe he was just paranoid. After all, there was no real reason why someone would be interested in his weird coffee cup accident. Right, a week later, when he least expected it, Serafina returned. This time, she was standing at his doorstep, her posture stiff and unyielding. "Mr. Rivers," she said in her usual blunt manner, "we need to talk." Ethan's stomach flipped. He had no idea how she had found him. He hadn't even told her his address. It didn't matter. There was no denying it now, she was here to investigate something involving him. But what, about what? Ethan asked, trying to sound calm, but failing miserably. "I don't know you." Serafina didn't flinch. "It's about your abilities." Ethan froze. Abilities? His heart skipped a beat. "What abilities?" "The ones you don't know you have," she said, stepping forward with an air of finality. "You've been influencing history. In ways you don't understand. And now, we need to talk about what happens next." At first, Ethan laughed it off. He couldn't help it. "Look, lady," he said, "I'm not some kind of time traveler or magical wizard. I'm a historian. You've got the wrong guy." Serafina raised an eyebrow. "A historian? Then why, when I checked the timeline, did I find a record of a minor event, the fall of a local coffee shop in your city, being altered in a way that shouldn't have been possible?" Ethan blinked. "Wait, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the butterfly effect," she said, her voice cold. "You changed a simple coffee spill into something far more significant. And it didn't stop there." Ethan was confused, his mind racing. The coffee spill had been an accident. But, had it really been? How could something so trivial make a ripple in time? And how was it even possible that she knew about it? Serafina stepped closer, her eyes intense. "This isn't just about coffee cups. It's about your manipulation of gravity, Mr. Rivers. You've been subtly controlling the very fabric of history without realizing it. That's why I'm here." As the hours ticked by, Ethan's world began to crack apart. The weight of Serafina's words, her insistence that his actions had altered history, felt like a crushing force pressing down on him. He had been playing with gravity his entire life, shifting the direction of falling objects, influencing small, seemingly insignificant moments. But never, ever had he imagined it could be so profound, so dangerous. "I don't even remember doing it," he admitted, his voice breaking. "How could I?" Serafina looked at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Because you didn't mean to. But that's what makes it dangerous. You've been the unseen hand, nudging history into new paths, and now, time itself is beginning to crack. And it's your fault." Ethan's mind was reeling. He stumbled back from Serafina, trying to wrap his head around her words. "But I don't control gravity," he said weakly. Sometimes things happen around me. I mean, I didn't ask for this. I don't even know how I do it. It's like something's just off, and I don't notice until it's too late." Serafina's eyes hardened, but there was no malice in them, only the weight of a knowledge she was desperately trying to impart. "That's exactly what makes you dangerous, Ethan. You've been nudging history for years without realizing it. Small things, like that coffee spill, or that time you moved a chair in your office and a famous scientist walked in just at the right moment. I've seen it. I've tracked it." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle between them. "And now, you're starting to change bigger things. You're not just a bystander anymore, Ethan. You're becoming the invisible hand." Ethan shook his head, his breath shallow. No, I can't be." I've just lived a normal life. Just a boring life. I'm not some kind of, time traveler. Time manipulator. This is insane. I don't even know what you're talking about. Serafina stepped closer, her presence still imposing but not unkind. You've been altering the course of history, Ethan. You might not have intended it, but your actions have far-reaching consequences. The thing is, time isn't a simple linear progression. It's more like a delicate web, and every move you make, every object you shift, creates ripples. Those ripples travel through time, expanding, influencing the events around them in ways you'll never be able to comprehend. And soon, those ripples are going to break free of their threads and begin to distort the timeline irreparably. Ethan felt a wave of dizziness. But I didn't do anything on purpose. It's just little things. A falling book. A piece of paper blowing off a desk. A coffee cup tipping over. That's not enough to change the world. Not to you, Serafina said, her tone softening just a touch. But to the timeline, it's like dropping a stone into a calm lake. You can't see the effect on the water until you look far enough out, but once those ripples reach the shore, they're massive. You've been shaping history without knowing it. Ethan took a step back, his head pounding. He tried to calm himself, but the words kept echoing in his mind, growing louder with every beat of his heart. He ran a hand through his hair. So, what? You want me to stop? Serafina nodded, her eyes unwavering. Yes. But it's not that simple, Ethan. You don't control time. Time controls you. And it's beginning to recognize that your power doesn't belong here. What do you mean? I mean, she said, her voice hardening again, there's someone else watching. Someone, or something, who sees you as a threat. Someone who's realized that the hand you've been using to manipulate gravity is beginning to shift the balance of time itself. Ethan swallowed. A threat? What does that mean? Who's watching me? Serafina's gaze darkened. That's what I'm here to find out. There's a fracture in the timeline, a crack that only you can repair. You've been operating in the background, pulling at the threads of history, but now you've drawn attention. There are other forces at play. Ethan's mind spun. He hadn't even begun to process the gravity, no pun intended, of the situation, and now, Serafina was talking about something else entirely, other forces. He wanted to say something, anything, to dismiss it all as a wild conspiracy, but something in Serafina's eyes told him that whatever she was saying was far from a joke. She continued, your ability to manipulate gravity isn't an isolated phenomenon, Ethan. It's a ripple that others have detected. You've unknowingly changed the course of history by making tiny, insignificant adjustments. But those changes, no matter how small, add up. And now, we're on the verge of something bigger, something far more dangerous. A shiver crawled down his spine. And what does that mean for me? It means, Serafina said slowly, that we need to find out who or what is behind this fracture before it grows. Time is fighting back, Ethan. It's trying to correct itself. It was the first time in his life that Ethan felt truly powerless. His entire world was falling apart around him, and he had no idea how to put it back together. He sat on the couch, staring blankly at Serafina, whose calm demeanor was beginning to unsettle him. She'd explained his unintentional manipulation of gravity, the ripples through time, and the dangerous forces coming after him, but he still didn't understand it all. I don't know how this happened, he said quietly. I never meant for any of this. I don't even remember half of it. Serafina's expression softened just slightly. I believe you. But that's part of the problem. You don't remember because you've been doing this subconsciously. Your mind has adapted to it, Ethan. You've learned to adjust your surroundings without realizing it. And now, those changes are so large that the universe has begun to notice. But how do I stop? He asked, feeling a flicker of panic rising in his chest. If it's all tied to gravity, how can I fix it? You're not going to stop it, Serafina said simply. At least, not in the way you think. You need to understand that the more you try to resist it, the worse it will get. The more you push against time, the harder it fights back. Ethan felt a wave of helplessness crash over him. So, what do we do? Just sit here and wait for time to fix itself? What happens if it doesn't? Serafina stood, her movements sharp and purposeful. We need to find the cause. The other force that's pulling the strings. There's someone, or something, that's been manipulating time in ways you don't understand. And if we don't stop it, time will break. And you think I'm the key? She nodded. You're the one who's been causing these ripples. But you're also the one who can fix them. We have to follow the trail of changes you've made, find where the fracture first occurred, and then make sure that what's out there can't reach you. Ethan stood up, feeling a sense of unease settle in his stomach. This is too much. I'm not some hero. I'm just a guy who got a little too curious about gravity. Serafina gave him a hard look. And that curiosity has changed history, Ethan. You don't get to back out of this. A long silence hung between them. Ethan stared out the window, his mind struggling to process it all. He'd always lived in the margins, history books, small lectures, forgotten facts, but now, he was at the center of something much bigger. It wasn't about his abilities anymore. It was about the fate of everything. The timeline was shifting around him, and if he didn't act, it could all fall apart. I don't even know where to begin, Ethan said, his voice small. You start by understanding this, Serafina said, her gaze unwavering. You're not in control of time. But that doesn't mean it's out of your hands. Time is malleable. It can be bent. It can be changed. But it's not like gravity. It's not just something you manipulate. It's something you understand. And that's what we need to do now. We need to figure out who or what is trying to break it. The next few hours passed in a blur. Ethan sat on the couch, letting Serafina explain more about the forces she was tracking, forces that seemed like the stuff of science fiction. As the pieces started to fall into place, Ethan began to understand. The timeline, as she had said, wasn't linear. It was far more fragile than he'd ever imagined, and his actions, his unknowing manipulation of gravity, had disturbed the natural flow of history. Serafina paced in front of him, her thoughts clearly moving at a mile a minute. We have to track the changes. If we can find where the first ripple happened, we might be able to reverse it. Ethan stood, feeling a determination that hadn't been there before. And how do we do that? Serafina turned to him, eyes sharp. We start with what you know. We follow the traces. It might be hard to see at first, but I promise you, the clues are there. We can fix this, Ethan. But only if you trust me. Ethan nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, or if he could even trust himself anymore. But he had no other choice. Time, it seemed, had left him with one inevitable truth: he was going to have to fix the mess he had unwittingly created. And he couldn't do it alone. Ethan didn't feel like he was equipped to handle this, not by a long shot. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't even a physicist. He was just a man who had spent too many years in dusty old libraries, reading about the past without ever considering how much power lay in the present moment. Now, time was his responsibility, and everything he thought he understood about the world was upended in the span of an afternoon. Serafina paced across the room again, her movements sharp, purposeful. She was used to this, Ethan could tell. She had the confidence of someone who had seen things that would make his own confusion look like child's play. But what was more terrifying was that she was talking about time as though it were a living thing, a creature that could be bent, broken, or healed. It was a terrifying thought, and Ethan didn't know where to begin. We can start by following the traces of your manipulations, Serafina said, her voice breaking into Ethan's thoughts. You've made small changes, yes, but there are patterns. Time remembers, Ethan. Even the smallest ripples, they leave a mark. We'll track it back to where this started. And then what? Ethan's voice cracked despite himself. You make it all go away? Like snapping your fingers? Nothing so easy. Serafina's eyes narrowed. But we can fix it. It's about following the thread, unraveling it one change at a time. You've been nudging things, and now we need to find the first place where you nudged too hard. And when we find that, we'll figure out what's trying to undo everything. There's something else behind all this, something trying to exploit the cracks in time. Ethan sat back down on the couch, rubbing his temples. It was all so overwhelming. He didn't know how to track the ripples, let alone stop them. But as Serafina talked, something began to click. He'd never truly believed in fate or destiny. He'd always thought of himself as a passive observer, an academic with a front-row seat to the world's grand play. But now he was the one pulling the strings, whether he wanted to or not. The invisible hand that he glanced up at Serafina, who was standing near the window, looking out at the gray sky as though she could see something he couldn't. She had an air about her, calm, composed. It was like she wasn't just part of the present, but something more, something beyond it. Time-traveling detective, he thought with a bitter laugh. He wasn't sure whether he should trust her or be terrified of her, but for now, she was the only ally he had. He cleared his throat. Okay, he said, his voice low but firm. Where do we start? Serafina turned to face him. We start with you. You need to think back to every time something strange happened, every time an object or event seemed to bend out of place. Start small, Ethan. Even the little things matter. Ethan nodded. His mind immediately went to that coffee cup. The cup that had hovered in mid-air, like it had defied the laws of physics. It had been a minor event in a cafe, but it had triggered a chain of actions. The barista had been startled, the woman across the table had spilled her own drink, and that tiny incident had led to a much bigger mess. That was just one instance, though. There had to be more, things he had dismissed over the years as coincidence. I've been doing this for years, Ethan murmured, more to himself than to Serafina. I've been altering things without even realizing it. You're not alone in this, Serafina said, her tone reassuring, though the weight of her words was anything but. You've made changes, yes, but it's not your fault. There's something pulling the strings from the other side, something manipulating your power. And that's what we need to uncover. Ethan could barely process what she was saying. Something pulling the strings? But who? What? As if reading his thoughts, Serafina spoke again, her eyes narrowing. The changes you've made aren't random, Ethan. There's a pattern. A deeper purpose behind these disruptions. I've seen it before. Someone, or something, is trying to exploit the cracks in time. Whoever's behind it doesn't want to restore the timeline. They want to break it. And you, with your gift, have become a pawn in their game. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. A pawn. That's what he was. He'd been used, without ever knowing. Without ever understanding. But the more he thought about it, the more his mind wandered back to that day, the day the coffee cup hovered. That day had set everything in motion. It was the first time he realized that maybe there was something more to his ability than a simple accident. He'd thought it was just a freak occurrence, a bizarre happenstance. But now, it felt like he'd been led here. It was no accident. How do we find this force? Ethan asked, suddenly desperate for answers. How do we track down whoever's manipulating time? Serafina's eyes darkened. That's the tricky part. Whoever's behind this is clever. They've been hiding in the shadows, working through the cracks you've created. But I can track them, Ethan. I have the tools to uncover the hidden forces in time. Ethan felt a flicker of hope, but it was brief. He had no idea what tools Serafina was talking about, or how she planned to find these hidden forces, but the idea that someone, or something, was actively trying to destroy the timeline was terrifying. They had to stop it, before it was too late. Serafina paced again, her mind clearly working through a series of steps he couldn't follow. We need to find the point of origin. The first fracture. From there, we can follow the changes and trace them back to the source. Whoever's behind this knows about you, Ethan. They're watching you, and they're using you to tear time apart. Wait, hold on, Ethan interrupted, a sudden thought racing through his mind. You said I've been changing history. But how could anyone, be aware of time fractures unless they've seen them happen? I mean, isn't that impossible? Serafina's gaze hardened, and she stopped pacing. Not impossible. Time is a living thing, Ethan. And there are others who can perceive these fractures. I can sense them, and I'm not the only one. But there are more powerful forces in time, ones that don't want history to be restored. They thrive on chaos, on the fractures. And right now, they're using you. The chill in her voice sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He hadn't realized the stakes were this high. He hadn't thought about what could be at risk, what was truly at risk, until now. Time wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a force that could be corrupted, torn apart, destroyed. And if what Serafina said was true, then he was the one who had set it all in motion. He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. So, what happens if we don't find this thing? What happens if we can't stop it? Serafina's expression softened, but only slightly. If we don't stop it, time will collapse in on itself. The fractures will grow larger, the events you've altered will spiral out of control, and eventually, the timeline will unravel entirely. There will be no history. No future. Only chaos. For the first time since their conversation began, Ethan felt a weight heavier than he had ever known. It wasn't just his life that was at stake now. It was everything. Time, the very thing that held reality together, was on the verge of falling apart. And it was his fault. He had started this. And now, he had to finish it. Serafina took a step closer, her eyes steady, almost sympathetic. I know it's a lot to take in, Ethan. But you're not alone in this. We'll find the source, and we'll stop it. Together. Ethan nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. There was no turning back now. He wasn't just a historian anymore. He wasn't just a passive observer of the past. He was part of something far bigger than he could comprehend. And whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to face the consequences of his actions, and save the timeline from itself. Ethan didn't sleep that night. It wasn't because of the strange encounter with Serafina or the weight of the consequences that had begun to loom over him. No, it was the endless questions swirling in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more tangled the whole situation became. His ability, this strange manipulation of gravity, was no longer a quirky anomaly, it was the fulcrum on which the entire timeline was teetering. And someone, something, had been using him, manipulating him without his knowledge. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the walls, trying to find a way to make sense of the mess he had created. History wasn't some set path. It wasn't just a collection of events. He'd always thought of time as something static, something that could be studied but not altered. But now, it felt like time was alive. And Ethan had become a player in a game he didn't understand. His mind kept returning to that moment in the cafe, the coffee cup hanging suspended in midair. A small thing, so insignificant, but it had rippled through time in ways he couldn't even begin to grasp. Every choice he had made, every small alteration, had piled on top of the last. What kind of butterfly effect was he even dealing with here? How many tiny, unnoticed actions had led to this? Then there was Serafina. She had been so certain about everything. She was calm, collected, methodical. But was she right? Was he really the cause of all of this? He didn't feel like someone capable of such a thing. How could anyone? He was just a man, not a god, not a being capable of bending time to his will, but that didn't change the fact that time was unraveling around him. The fractures were real. He could sense them now, too, in the air around him. Subtle shifts, like the world was slightly off kilter. Even as he sat there, the universe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, blinking at the screen. It was a message from Serafina, just a short note, but it set his heart racing. "We have a lead. Meet me at the old library. It's time to find out who's behind this." The old library wasn't anything like the modern, sleek buildings filled with digital catalogs and glass walls that Ethan was used to. This place had history, and it wore it on its worn bricks, crooked shelves, and the smell of aging paper that hung heavy in the air. Located in a forgotten corner of the city, it was the kind of place that made you feel like time itself had decided to take a nap here. There was a weight to the silence, an age-old stillness that made Ethan's footsteps echo louder than they should have. Serafina was already there, standing in the far corner, scanning through a row of old leather-bound books. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of lamps placed sporadically across the space. It was the kind of place where secrets were kept, where knowledge was buried and waiting to be discovered. Ethan felt strangely at home here, like this old building was a kind of sanctuary, something untouched by the distortions of time. "Did you find anything?" Ethan asked, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. Serafina didn't look up from the books. "Maybe. But we're running out of time." "Literally." Ethan nodded, a shiver crawling up his spine. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" "A sign," she said, finally turning to face him. Her expression was grim. "Something to pinpoint the source. We've followed your changes, Ethan, but we're still missing the key, the thing that's been manipulating the timeline. And we have to find it, or everything will fall apart." He could hear the urgency in her voice, and it unsettled him. He didn't know how to stop what was happening. He didn't even know what it was they were looking for. But the way Serafina spoke made it clear that the clock was ticking, and they had no time to waste. Ethan walked over to her, casting a glance at the shelf she was inspecting. There were rows of old texts, some he recognized, others ancient and unfamiliar. His eyes caught one book in particular, its cover worn and nearly faded, the title barely legible. "What's this one?" Serafina's eyes narrowed. "That's the one. I think it's connected to the fractures. It's been hidden here for a reason." She pulled the book from the shelf and opened it carefully, the pages creaking under her fingers as if they had been untouched for centuries. Ethan peered over her shoulder, reading the first few lines. It was written in an old language, one that looked vaguely familiar but didn't make any sense. The words were cryptic, like some ancient code. "We need to translate this," Serafina muttered, her fingers skimming the page as she tried to make sense of the words. This could be the key to understanding how the fractures began. Ethan watched her for a moment, trying to suppress the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He hadn't come here for ancient texts or riddles. He had come here to fix what he had broken. But as he glanced at the book again, something about it made his skin crawl. There was something about this language that didn't just feel old, it felt wrong, like it shouldn't be here at all. And suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder. "Do you think someone else has been reading this?" Ethan asked. Serafina's fingers froze on the page. "I think that's exactly what's been happening. Whoever's behind these distortions, they've been tracking the changes just like we are. And they're using this book to guide them." She slammed the book shut, her expression hardening. "It's too dangerous to keep reading it here. We need to go somewhere safer." "Safer?" Ethan asked. "How could anywhere be safer than this place?" "We need to get out of here," she said again, her voice low but urgent. "Time is fighting back harder now, Ethan. It's not just you that's changing things. Whoever else is involved is trying to rewrite history in their own way. And if we don't stop them, there won't be anything left to save. Ethan's heart raced. He didn't know what was worse, being stuck in a library, trying to decode a centuries-old text, or knowing that someone was out there, using the same power he had, to break the timeline. Serafina moved toward the door. Come on, we need to move fast. Time is collapsing around us. Ethan hesitated, the weight of everything pressing down on him. But there was no time to second-guess it. He followed Serafina out of the library, the heavy door creaking shut behind him, sealing off the secrets of the past. The air outside was no better. The moment they stepped into the street, Ethan could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There was something off about the world around him, something he hadn't noticed before. It was like the very air he breathed was distorted, out of sync with the reality he had always known. Buildings loomed overhead, but they felt like they didn't belong here, like they were somehow out of place. Where are we going? Ethan asked, his voice tight to the source. Serafina replied. We'll find the fractures. They're closing in on us, but we can track them. I'll show you how to see them. She handed him something small and metallic, a device he didn't recognize. This is a temporal scanner. It'll help us find the disturbances. Ethan looked at the device, a mixture of confusion and disbelief running through him. It felt too futuristic, too out of place for the world he knew. But he held it in his hand, feeling the weight of the task ahead of him. Serafina led the way, moving with a purpose as she guided him down the street, past crowded stores and bustling pedestrians who didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. Ethan kept his eyes peeled, trying to stay focused on the task at hand, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something was creeping up behind them, something sinister. Suddenly, the scanner beeped loudly, interrupting his thoughts. There, Serafina said, pointing to a nearby alley. We've got a disturbance. Ethan's stomach turned. This was it. They were close. The alley was dark and narrow, the kind of place where shadows clung to the walls like they had a life of their own. But as they stepped into the alley, the air felt alive, charged, like something was about to happen. And in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever they were about to face wasn't just a small change to history. It was something far bigger. Something more dangerous. Serafina stepped forward, her eyes scanning the shadows. It's close now, Ethan. Stay sharp. As they moved deeper into the alley, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was waiting for them at the end of this journey, but one thing was clear, the timeline was breaking, and if they didn't fix it soon, there might be no history left to save. And then he heard it. A low hum, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. The fracture was here.